Well, analytically speaking, the two versions that you mention are not necessarily mutually exclusive. You could believe that Russia was seeking and planning for a confrontation, but that Georgia, technically speaking, started it. How things exactly transpired in those days of August, I think we may never find out exactly. And I'm sure we can assume and we can conclude that there were mistakes made on the Georgian side as well. However, I think by now the body of evidence that suggests that this war was premeditated on the part of the Russian leadership is overwhelming. I think it actually has been a mistake, and including a mistake on the part of the Georgian leadership to put so much focus on exactly what happened on August 7, because that was only, so to speak, the trigger of a very long process. I mean, as Mr. Putin's former advisor, Andrei Larionov, has observed, when you talk about starting a war, people usually refer to this war as a 5-day war, assuming that it started, in fact, on August 7. By any standards, the war both continued longer than that because Russian military operations on Georgian territory went on, but also you could make a very strong argument that the war began much earlier. For example, the Russian downing of a Georgian drone over sovereign, recognized Georgian territory in Abkhazia took place in April. You could also talk about the deployment of Russian troops in South Ossetia. That took place actually in as early as 2006, when we know that the Russian military built a tank refueling station in the upper districts of South Ossetia, to which observers were never allowed. More specifically, of course, to your question is the very impressive military buildup that the Russian leadership engaged in the North Caucasus over the months of spring and summer of 2008, which included, of course, the deployment of paratroopers in a supposedly peacekeeping operation in Abkhazia. Last time I checked, paratroopers are not usually deployed in peacekeeping missions. They fulfill entirely different military functions. Likewise, during the spring, you also had the introduction by Russia of railway troops into Abkhazia, which was completely outside of any peacekeeping agreement that existed. There was no mandate for Russian military troops that were engineering troops for railways to be on Georgian territory in Abkhazia. They rebuilt a railway linking Abkhazia to Russia that had been in dilapidated conditions since the Soviet breakup, and the railway was finished on the 30th of July, if I'm not mistaken, 10 days before it was used to bring in hundreds of tanks and thousands of troops down towards the Georgian border. Incidentally, by the way, opening an entirely unprovoked second front in the war that had just begun in South Ossetia 2 days earlier. These are just some of the examples of elements in Russian policy, events or things that were actually done by the Russian leadership that suggest very strongly that there was a premeditated intention to actually invade Georgia during the summer or fall of 2008.
Happened when Saakashvili came to power through the Rose Revolution. He got rid of all of the senior people who'd been in the government of Shevardnadze, all of them. So he brought in a bunch of 20-somethings. Not surprisingly, these people were totally loyal to him, but they had no experience. So they didn't know how to read things. They didn't know how to understand. So that there was no one who would explain to Saakashvili that the testosterone powered statements of Condi Rice and George Bush in Bucharest were not nearly as important to his future as the cautious warnings he was getting from John Tefft, the American ambassador. Hence, he did something which was provocative. It wasn't illegal, but it was provocative, unnecessarily so, on the assumption that the Americans would back him up, and the Russians invaded his country and occupied almost a third of it. People are angry. They're angry at him. They're angry at this constant displacement of elites. This is a country that's economically in trouble, probably going to be in more trouble. There are a lot of people who were in the former regime, who were unhappy with it, participated in the Rose Revolution, but have been forced out because Saakashvili does not tolerate much difference of opinion. So what you're seeing is, again, another effort to get rid of him. The problem, of course, is what happens when you replace Saakashvili, if you do. I personally think something will be brokered and Saakashvili will lose some of his powers. I don't expect him to be forced out of office. Personal view. Watch me be proved wrong in the next 12 hours, but that's what I think that ultimately there's going to be any transition is going to take some time.
Well, how is the opposition, these protests, affected by the presence of Russia in Georgian territory?
Well, first off, some of them say we need to talk to Russia no matter what. I mean, as bad as Russia is. Some of them are certainly being encouraged to go after Saakashvili, given Putin and to a lesser extent Medvedev's constant remarks that Moscow will not talk to Saakashvili. So the idea is get rid of Saakashvili and maybe you can find a negotiated way out. I think that's naive, but I think that's what some people think. I think the Russians have no intention of backing down. I think they know that if they were to concede or to de-recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia, they would have a very hard time holding their own country together.
The Russian leadership understands. The war in Georgia was very popular in Russia, by the way, with the population. And the Russian leadership understands that foreign aggression is a way of consolidating the population around a fragile and corrupt regime. So they have every reason to use that instinct, that imperialist instinct in the population, in order to rally support, in effect, for themselves. The various kind of, all this talk about new security architecture is all garbage, really. It's just nonsense. This is what we call in Russia information for fools. It's just something that they have people on their payroll who spin this. They have people here who one way or another can be influenced, who they can get to repeat it. It's not worth a moment's attention. What it is just the desire to dominate for no reason whatsoever, and accept that by provoking conflicts, by dominating their neighbors, by entering into an antagonistic situation with the civilized world, Russia can convince the Russian people, the Russian authorities can convince the Russian people that they are protecting them against an external threat, which of course they created. Russia doesn't need friends, it needs enemies. And the best way to create them is to take people who would be happy to be friends and seek to deny them of their freedom of choice and maneuver. And that's what's happening in Ukraine, Georgia. It's interesting, these riots in Moldova, that because of Russia's behavior, neither side was interested in mediation by Russia, but on the contrary, they turned to the West. Russia will surround itself with enemies, and then it will pretend to be a besieged fortress, which can't afford the luxury of human rights and democratic pluralism, with the result that the corrupt group that's in power now will be able to rule that much longer. Not forever, but that much longer.